Good morning, everybody. The Simple Handicap for Friday, January 3rd. Thank you for making me a part of your morning, and it's good to chat with everybody for the first time in 2025. A very happy new year to everybody. Hopefully your week, or perhaps half a week, or maybe you're still on holidays, you're still on vacation, is going very well, and your Friday is off to an awesome start. Final episode of the 2024 NFL regular season show, 18 plus weeks every morning. Thank you, everybody who has tuned in any part of the way so far this season. I will say, going forward for the playoffs, I'm going to experiment with a little bit of a different format. I'm going to do the same opening odds show that will be uploaded as soon as the playoff odds are up. I'll be doing those Sunday evening coming up, reacting to the wild card round, and then I'll be doing those the following weekend, and then for the championship, I'll be doing that too, and then obviously for the Super Bowl right after Championship Sunday concludes. Those will be the usual episodes that you know and expect. But what I think I'm going to experiment with for these playoffs is doing game-by-game episodes, go a little bit more in depth on the matchups, give my thoughts, rather than uploading a rundown as we have for every day. The playoff download mark is very different than typically what I see during the regular season. So this might be more informative. I haven't decided if I do it, but what I do know is the daily breakdown of everything just becomes a bit much in the playoffs with so few games. And so I want to try add a little bit more value to everybody listening rather than just kind of do the rundown every morning for just a handful of games that, quite frankly, once you get past Wednesday, you don't see a lot of movement and you don't see a lot of changing as well. So I'll see how those go. Those would be uploaded to YouTube as well and pre-recorded segments. We'll play it by ear. I'll see what's going on, and then I'll keep everybody updated here on the podcast feed. But you'll for sure get the opening line reaction to everything, and then something for every game throughout the playoffs to keep you informed. The last episode will be the reaction show to the Super Bowl opening odds, as always, following the championship game. Another bit of wrench in the plan. My wife and I are making a big move during the bye week before the Super Bowl, and so that is going to factor in a little bit. That is after the final episode airs, but a little bit, I would say, distracted during championship week. Looking forward to that as well. So that's kind of factoring in a little bit. It's a big life shift for both of us, but I think will absolutely be for the better and set us up for a pretty good spot going into next season to focus even more and grow the show even more as we can. But as it stands now this season, the show has passed 3.1 million downloads. I appreciate everybody who has been a part of that. Some of you have listened for a very long time, and so that's a pretty special milestone to get past the 3 million download mark and even exceed it. And next year, we'll make a push for 5 million at the end of the 2025 season. All right, let's get to Week 18. There's a lot going on. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it. There is a lot going on and a lot to sort through and a lot to think about. Just a couple high-level things. First and foremost, weather this week, not super impactful. We see the Saturday games with fringe impactful wind. The gusts are above 20 miles per hour, so something to keep in mind as you look at both of those totals. On Sunday, the Titans game has some rain with wind. Giants, Eagles, Dolphins, Jets, mild wind, but could increase. Next week for the wildcard games is where there's going to be a big weather impact. If you haven't heard about it in your region and you're listening, in Canada or the U.S., we're getting hammered with a polar vortex. And the temperatures forecasted for the possible wildcard spots next week, incredibly cold, chance of 20-mile-plus wind in multiple spots. It could get ugly. Now, we're a ways away, 9 days away from the playoff game, so a lot can change between now and then, but something to keep in the back of your mind. When we're focusing just on Week 18, as I bring that up as a weather note, there's kind of a divide that I'm looking at here with all of these games. Favorites have been on an incredible run, both straight up and against the spread the last few weeks. If I think back 12, 15, 17 years even, at that time there was a big advantage to play the teams that had the extra incentive, which are almost always favored in games in the final week. That has gone away in recent years, where playing the team with quote-unquote nothing to play for and picking spots has been much more advantageous. We have seen every sit versus no sit equation priced into this market so far this week. And I'm starting to look at this board as we stand here Friday morning, looking forward to Saturday and Sunday games. And if I was to bet anything now, I think I would have a hard time trying to advocate for any favorite that is currently on the board, especially so in those sit versus non-sit scenarios. I just look at some of these prices and can't help but relate to last week's prices and taking multiple models and combining prices and looking what we have in-house and looking at public composite ratings. There are some major adjustments to some of these games, but I feel like this year specifically in the final week, it is more difficult to gauge these dead teams, if you will, than ever before, because we have 3 teams now rated worse than any other team has finished in the ratings the last 2 seasons. It's a very wide gap between the haves and have-nots in the final week, and that's leading, I think, to a lot of these favorites covering, a lot of these spreads not being able to catch up. And while some of these are very tempting just price-wise to oppose, there is an element of just how dead are some of these teams and what are you going to get. I'm finding it very difficult this week to come up with a whole lot. The other thing that I would say is the incentive props are just getting blasted in the very few places they are available. They're getting blasted at pick'em sites. This is incredibly well known at this point. If I was to look at any props between now and Sunday, what I don't think is going to be priced right are some of these second and third string running backs, and there's a ton of them this week, that are going to be live for anytime touchdowns and last touchdowns as well, where you get a pretty big pricing divide. But there are some teams that are rotating a lot of guys in the backfield. There are some injuries that are going to force those guys into the lineups. And so if you haven't bet anything yet this week, I wouldn't necessarily go chasing some of these need-to-win teams. I would try look for the opposite, and I would try to find some of these second or third string running backs to potentially circle and take a shot with in anytime and last touchdown score prices at longer odds once those are posted later this week. And so I'll go down the board. I'll tell you what I know about these games. I'll tell you where everything stands. I'll get you set up. And then the next 2 days, very, very intriguing betting spots, but I don't know if we're going to have anything released publicly. And I don't know how much more is going to come of this week for sides and totals unless some of these prices get a little bit higher come Sunday morning. So it starts off Saturday, Cleveland on the road at the Baltimore Ravens. Ravens are 20-point favorites with a total of 41.5. Bailey Zappi is going to start. DTR is expected to play as well. The Browns are treating this on offense kind of like a preseason game. I'm not too sure what they could possibly take away from either of these quarterbacks. They have both struggled anytime they have been on the field, and they're facing a Ravens team that wins the NFC North with a victory. They're 20-point favorites. They're going to be very comfortable moving the ball on offense, and defensively for both of these quarterbacks, it is a mismatch. Now, 20 points is just a monster number, but the way that Baltimore is able to operate and the fact that they just laid and covered and nearly as big of a number just a couple of weeks ago against the Giants, they're just built to run out and cover big numbers like this, especially against bad quarterbacks like this on a Browns team that is dealing with a bevy of injuries as well to some of their key players. This is ugly. Now, last week number, when I start to say this is pretty jacked up and pretty inflated, would have been Baltimore minus 13 on a neutral. This is now pushing 20. You have the QB downgrade. There is absolutely a premium and a tax here if you want to lay the number with Baltimore. I think that's pretty obvious at this number. The question is, what is the offensive upside here for the Cleveland Browns with either of those quarterbacks? Cincinnati on the road at Pittsburgh. Big game for both teams. Stating the obvious in that perspective, we've seen this as high as 2.5 for Cincinnati. That's where there was resistance, and Steelers money came back the other way. Chase Brown and T. Higgins both listed as questionable for the Bengals. The Bengals elevated Kendall Hinton from the practice squad to the active roster. I don't view him as a true running back. I don't know if anybody does. I don't know if that's a sign to Chase Brown's status. What I think is more telling is earlier in the week, Zach Taylor went out of his way to really praise Khalil Herbert, like excessively so. And I thought that was odd and a bit out of place and out of time. I know there was optimism yesterday that Brown is going to play. I don't know if that's certain. I think it's a true 50-50 shot in that game time decision. So something to keep in mind if you're looking at the Bengals. We've seen that have a bit of impact in the market as well, potentially as a contributing factor to why the Steelers have taken money, but also the fact that if you're looking at this number and just trying to gauge where the price is, where it would have been, you're starting to think about the Bengals and how much attention they've got in the market. Last week number was pick on a neutral. Cincinnati closed -3 at home in week 14. And so clearly with Cincinnati laying points on the road, it's an adjustment to last week where the Bengals get by against the Broncos in overtime. This is also a bit of an odd schedule game, I would say, to an extent, with the Ravens potentially clinching the division. But knowing Mike Tomlin, I don't think he is going to change much based on what the Ravens do in the first game. I think this game, Cincinnati-Pittsburgh, if there's an impact on anything, it is going to be the Chargers-Raiders game, which we'll talk about in a second. Sunday games, New Orleans on the road at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Buccaneers were 14. There were 2 different releases from 2 different pros on the Saints that took out the 14. It got back to as low as 13. We are now trending back to 14. In this game specifically, last week number, Tampa Bay -8.5 on a neutral. This was a game that Tampa Bay closed 3.5 in Tampa Bay in week 6 against Rattler. At New Orleans in week 6 against Rattler. They won 51-27. So it's a repeat matchup against the same backup quarterback for the Saints and against a lot of the injured players that the Saints are currently dealing with. In terms of injuries this week, it gets a little bit worse. I know Chris Olave is a full participant at practice. That to me seems like a reach to bring him back, given his health status for the final game. I don't buy that Derek Carr is going to play. I don't buy that Alvin Kamara is going to play. And I don't buy that Kendre Miller is going to be able to pass concussion protocol. MVS, dealing with the chest and back injury, could possibly return. He would be helpful on offense as a 14-point dog, but obviously at stake, the Buccaneers win the division with a victory. There is nothing but videos and articles about the Mike Evans prop. He is at his highest price of the season by 11 yards on the premium. Tons of subjectivity around the commentary from pressers and so much supporting how much Mike Evans is going to be involved and how much the team wants him to get the record. I think we've all heard it a million times by now, and the prop market is certainly reflecting that. Last week's number, again, as we're thinking about 13.5 here with the importance of the game for Tampa Bay, 8.5 on a neutral. Game is in Tampa Bay. You add home field. It's a field goal premium here, and that could be warranted, and we could potentially get back to 14 if some of these injuries hold for the Saints. Last week when Olave was ruled out, we saw about a half-point move back in favor of the Raiders, even though their plane was delayed 12 hours and they got in about 10 hours before kickoff, which was an odd scenario. Zero impact in the market. Buffalo, New England. Bills 2.5-point favorites. Total 37.5. Nothing but under money all week from pros. We've seen this get buried to the under. Josh Allen will start. My expectation is he's out before the end of the first quarter. He's going to keep the streak alive. For New England, it's back and forth. Yesterday was another 180. The staff has been back and forth since week 1 when they couldn't decide who was going to start at quarterback. Same thing here. Drake May is expected to start after it was kind of labeled uncertain Tuesday. That came out yesterday as Alex Van Pelt said that he is going to start yesterday despite being limited in practice for the second straight day. Joe Milton has been taking first-team reps in practice this week, and so he is likely to see some time. Christian Gonzalez, the best cornerback for the team and a top 3 corner in the NFL, dealing with the concussion. He is a DNP. That would be a loss against whoever Trubisky is throwing to if he is not on the field for the Pats. Chicago on the road at the Green Bay Packers. Packers 10-point favorites. Took money yesterday. Was lingering around 9 for the majority of the week. Matt LaFleur needed to come out and say it for the second or third time that he is going to play all of his starters. But Josh Jacobs kind of put a hedge on that, where Josh Jacobs says he does not expect to get a ton of touches in the game. And 3 weeks ago, he had a line in a presser in a locker room interview where he said that he was trying to manage his reps down the stretch and be fresh for the playoffs. So as I start to talk about these backup running backs and who we're going to get, you're seeing that in Baltimore. You're seeing that in Cincinnati. You're going to see that in Tampa Bay. And it's probably doesn't seem like it's going to be White based on what we saw last week. Buffalo, New England, 2 teams that could be changing. Here we have the Packers. If Jacobs is wanting his reps managed, there's potential for a lot of carries to go elsewhere on the team, which we saw cash in at a pretty big price against the Saints on Monday Night Football just before Christmas. So something to keep in mind in this game. Miami on the road at the New York Jets. Dolphins a 1-point favorite across the board, total 38.5. My expectation is that this is a Snoop Huntley start for Miami, with Tua still dealing with multiple injuries. I would expect Jalen Waddle to return, as he was limited in practice yesterday, and there was expectation earlier in the week that he would be back on the field. For the Jets, a ton of locker room issues. Guys want out. There's already active interviews that seem to have taken on priority. Quinnen Williams still a DNP. Sauce Gardner still a DNP. Reed is already talking about hitting free agency and getting out of the team. Garrett Wilson is requesting a trade. So it is a mess in New York right now. But with Tua not starting, we are seeing the Jets take a little bit of money. And that would lead me to believe if we get the announcement that he is unable to play officially, we might see this get down to a pick'em. But I certainly think there's going to be intrigued bettors for Miami later in the week, possibly taking Huntley with the Dolphins, especially so if the Cincinnati Bengals end up losing to the Pittsburgh Steelers on Saturday evening. Kansas City on the road at the Denver Broncos. Broncos 10.5-point favorites, total 40. Broncos win, and they are in. There are then secondary waves of scenarios if the Broncos lose versus Cincinnati and Miami and how those games play out for the final seed in the AFC playoffs. Carson Wentz will start for Kansas City. The expectation is that Olajuwon is going to get time, likely later in the third, fourth quarter. I thought there was a very good clip by Brian Baldinger yesterday showing how Wentz performed last season in a similar spot for the LA Rams, talking about how he's trying to justify further contracts, staying in the league. And as this gets out to 10.5, this game, since it opened, the expectation was that the Chiefs were sitting everybody. This game opened 7.5. We are now all the way out to 10.5. So again, as we start to talk about some of these moves, it's a lot of no news that once it hit the screen and was official, a lot of these numbers pushed out even further than they were. And this is now 10.5. We think about last week's number, which obviously would have included all the starters for the Chiefs. Very likely would have been KC -4. The Chiefs closed -7 at home in week 11. You would have saw KC -4 on a neutral. It is now Broncos -10.5 at home. When this hit 11, there was action back the other way that took out those numbers for Kansas City. A big-time move here on the Denver Broncos and a big adjustment, more than 14 points through a ton of key numbers. It's a big, big swing here for the Broncos. LA Chargers on the road at the Las Vegas Raiders. Chargers 4.5-point favorites, total 41.5. As I mentioned, the Saturday night game is going to have an impact. If Pittsburgh wins, I believe we see the Chargers approach this in a bit of a eased manner, as they're going to be locked into the 6th seed. If Cincinnati wins, I would fully expect the Chargers to play this game like a playoff game. As they can improve their seeding, they would get the Texans in the 4 seed going on the road to Houston to play indoors, rather than getting the 6 seed with a loss if the Pittsburgh Steelers were to lose, and then have to go to Baltimore to play outdoors in that cold with the brother versus brother rematch in a game where the Chargers were outclassed earlier in the season. So if we see that Saturday night game won by Cincinnati, we are probably going to see this number move a little bit, and we're probably going to see a change of opinion on how the Chargers are going to approach this game. Last week number, Chargers -5 on a neutral. This is lingering, slightly leaning towards the Chargers in terms of an upgrade, just half a point lower. Jacksonville on the road at the Indianapolis Colts. 4.5 is the number across the board, down from 5.5, total 44. Anthony Richardson still dealing with his back injury and spasms. All signs look like this could be the final game of the career for Joe Flacco, starting for the Indianapolis Colts. Jags have been competitive down the stretch with Mac Jones. Last week against Tennessee, I thought he looked better than given credit for. Still a lot of young skill position talent on the Jags that are competing down the stretch. A lot of noise and uncertainty around the Colts coaching staff, as well as a lot of the Colts players. Panthers on the road at Atlanta. Falcons still an 8-point favorite across the board. They obviously need to win and hope Tampa Bay loses as a 2-touchdown favorite at home to have a chance at getting the South and getting into the playoffs. Washington on the road at Dallas. Yesterday, Commanders money took out the 4.5. We are out to 6.5 and leaning towards 7. Everything that Dan Quinn has said this entire week is about playing hard, trying to improve seeding, and now it's the Dallas Cowboys who very well could have Trey Lance seeing time in this game. Probably not a starter in Trey Lance, but one reporter suggests that he is going to get time in this game, which changes the outlook certainly for the Dallas Cowboys. Seattle on the road at the LA Rams. Seahawks out to 6.5. We talk about no news. I mean, you go back to the Tuesday podcast, and we were pretty spot on with a lot of this. And the expectation was McVay is going to rest everybody. And that expectation became a reality yesterday and became official. But I go back to Tuesday and Wednesday, there was movement on Seattle. 3.5s and 4s were bet. That was the expectation that we were going to see a sit. And once it became official, 4.5s turned into 6.5s. This has happened in a lot of games. A lot of no news became official, and we saw a bump after the initial wave of money came in on that news. And this is the example here. And I just think about it. It's not like a preseason game where you have so many guys on the roster and you're subbing through units. There was a really good clip with Belichick and Harbaugh from earlier in the week talking on an interview where he's like, you can't set everybody like a preseason game. I mean, there's not enough guys on the roster to do that. You're sitting key guys, but there's a lot of guys that still have to play. And I think the difference, too, is some of these quarterbacks are not like the preseason quarterbacks. And a lot of these games are being bet like preseason. And I'm not running out to say, like, hey, run and bet the Rams, especially so at 6.5. At 7, it becomes a bit of a different discussion. But it's just, I mean, I look at some of these numbers. Again, last week number here would have been Rams -3 on a neutral. We are now threatening getting to 7. So it's a Rams home game. Is this really a 12-point move? Is it really a 12-point move? I don't know. San Francisco on the road at Arizona. Cardinals 4.5-point favorites. Total 43 across the screen. Got as low as 42.5 at a number of books as a total that was being bet down pretty consistently throughout the week. And then there was a disagreement at that point as we saw the number come back the other way later in the day yesterday after bottoming out at 42.5. Yet to be determined if this is Dobbs or Allen. There was a comment earlier in the week from Shanahan where he said that Dobbs only came in replacement of Purdy because they thought if they needed a backup, his mobility would have been a benefit. For Arizona, James Conner goes to IR. Very likely sets this up for a Michael Carter game out of the backfield. Houston on the road at the Tennessee Titans. Titans will play both quarterbacks, Levis and Rudolph, going to get time, likely a timeshare split. This game got as low as pick'em after Houston announced that they would be playing starters. And we saw a little bit of Tennessee money come back against that sentiment in the last 24 hours. Minnesota, Detroit, awesome game to wrap up the season on Sunday night. Total got as high as 58. We were in our Slack channel where we discuss all the bets. We have all the research. Everybody works all day. And we were watching the Monday night game against the Niners, and there were messages going back and forth. So we're waiting for this total to open. And there was Pinnacle posted, and we saw a couple other books post on the screen as well as the game was going on. It was 52.5. And we're sending messages, 52.5, 53.5, 54.5, 55.5, all the way up to 58 we watched it get to before under money came back. We're now back to 55.5. This is a game where it's a total that's so high with two teams that have changed so much that there is just going to be automatic disagreement from a lot of math guys who say a total cannot be this high. I can never get there, and they're betting the under. And we're seeing that money come in and have an impact late in the week so far at the highest limits, where all of the over money was earlier in the week, right as that game on Monday night was ending, post-game into the morning. That's when a lot of the over money came. So the last moves that we've seen have been on the under. It's a very tough under to get to, especially after yesterday, where all of a sudden Ben Johnson is at the podium. And I know these two teams have played earlier, but he was kind of indirectly taking shots or jabs at Flores for kicking him off the staff when he was in Miami. He said he was predetermined. It doesn't sound like it's the best respect level between the two, or there's like a little bit of bad blood brewing behind the scenes. very subjective, but like you think about the Lions defense and how that looked against San Francisco. You think about how good the Lions offense looked and the Vikings and how they can get guys open. This game just screams wide open, explosive, big plays with two staffs that are just calling offensive plays at such a high level and two coaches that are very willing to gamble with everything on the line and the importance of the 1 seed. Man, I couldn't get to being comfortable taking the under even at 55.5 as it's standing, and the latest bets so far this week have been on the under as well. That's a tough one to swallow and a tough one to get to. Final game on the board, Giants on the road at the Philadelphia Eagles. Eagles, a soft 3 across the board with a total of 37.5. Eagles planning to sit everybody. We won't see Saquon Barkley. We will not see Jalen Hurts, who is still in the protocol. A.J. Brown, as we talked about on Tuesday, kind of hinted to all of this, and they're not going to play everybody. The question for the Giants is how much are they going to try get the ball to Malik Neighbors? He trails Brock Bowers by 4 receptions for the rookie record 4 receptions, and they get to set the bar first. As he plays early, the Raiders play late. That's going to make for an interesting prop scenario. If I have 2 of these incentives that stand out to me, I would say there's 3. The DK Metcalf one, I think, is very real for Seattle. I think that's more intriguing than the Geno Smith angle that everybody is talking about, and rightfully so. It's a massive amount of money. But the duel between Neighbors and Bowers in those 2 games, I think could be quite intriguing, especially if Neighbors sets a big number. If he goes out there and gets 8 or 9 catches, and he all of a sudden has a lead on Bowers, even if it's a little bit higher, and then Bowers has to play catch-up, and maybe it's a spot where Cincinnati loses that game, Pittsburgh wins, and you have the Chargers resting some key guys, and that opens up the offense for the Raiders. I think those 3 guys really stand out to me. And again, this is certainly another game where you're looking at backup and third-string running backs as having potential. There's a ton of those on the board this week, and I think as we get to Saturday night and Sunday, and there's some willingness for these prices to be posted, there's going to be a lot of opportunities. I think SGPs are certainly in play. It's a rare time that I think really stands out as being quite advantageous. You also have a lot of backup quarterbacks and a handful of them that are mobile, as you're looking at some rushing yard, perhaps overs. Last season, Wentz for the Rams was running a ton when he's not really that guy, but you're looking at some of these quarterbacks trying to prove something and later bodies out to justify a contract or another spot in the league. We see that come through quite a bit. So there's a lot to look at the next 48 hours, and hopefully this episode wraps up the season and gives you something to think about. So again, I'll be back, as always, with the Opening Lines Reaction podcast. It'll be up Sunday evening to get you set for wildcard weekend. I'll do it for divisional weekend. I'll do it for conference championships, and then I'll have the live reaction to the Super Bowl. And then I'll have updates throughout the week. I'll just play it by ear. I'm thinking I'll go the game-by-game route, and those will be uploaded to the podcast feed. But we'll see how it goes next week. Again, thank you for everybody for listening this regular season. Have a fantastic Friday. Have a fantastic weekend. And we'll chat to you talking about wild card opening lines after the games conclude Sunday evening.